Coming up next is The World of Work.
And you're too old to work, too old to work. When you're too old to work, you're too young to die.
This is The World of Work, and I'm your host, Shep Cohen. It's not very often that you're able to find a book which brings back good memories for everyone who opens it. Our guests today, Joe Garner and Michael Ashley, co-authors of It's Saturday Morning, celebrating the golden era of cartoons, 60s through the 90s, have brought back memories of the 60s through the 90s, memories of watching cartoons on Saturday mornings, feel-good memories. Even the cover takes us back to the cartoon era. As a child in the 60s and through the 90s, there was nothing more, nothing better than lying on your couch, eating a sugary cereal, and watching cartoons on Saturday morning. Joe Garner and Michael Ashley, welcome to The World of Work.
Thanks, Shep. Nice to be with you.
Nice to be with you. And I was so excited about this show that I've brought two experts on watching cartoons with me. My brother-in-law, Stuart Mark, and my wife, Sharon Mark Cohen. So they might chime in for, here and there.
Very good. Wonderful.
And how did the two of you know each other?
Well, we were working on a book. I was contracted, this is Michael speaking, I met Joe because I was contracted to work on a book where I was interviewing entrepreneurs, people who had done amazing things with their lives. And Joe is a New York Times bestseller many times over. And so I interviewed him, and we got to know each other. And then we hit it off and began collaborating with each other on projects. And we both had an affinity for this topic in general and popular culture that brought us to this.
That was my next question. What inspired you to write a book about Saturday morning cartoons?
Well, I think it's the fact that, this is Joe talking, all of the books that I've done, this is number 13 for me, have all focused on some aspect of popular culture, starting with seminal moments in news with a book called We Interrupt This Broadcast, sports moments and The Crowd Goes Wild, and 100 Yards of Glory, movie moments in now showing unforgettable moments in the movie. So all of these large illustrated hardcover collections of different aspects of pop culture. And one day Michael and I were talking. There's about a 20-year age difference between Michael and I. I'm on the young end of the baby boomers, and he's on the older end of the Gen Xers. And we started talking about aspects of our shared, childhood and just things in pop culture that don't exist today. And one of the things that we landed on was Saturday morning cartoons. And, how kids today have no idea what it's like to wait an entire week to be able to grab that bowl of sugary cereal first thing in the morning on a Saturday and just sit down and watch, one great cartoon after another. And that shared experience, and what that did for us was, it sort of dictated what we were going to play later that day or throughout the week until the next Saturday when we'd get a chance to sit down there and have that collective experience. So we just thought, what a great subject to kind of give people an opportunity, a real immersive opportunity to experience again. And that's what we tried to create in It's Saturday Morning.
And Joe Garner, you, I believe, would watch when you were younger with your brother?
No, that was Michael.
Oh, Michael, okay.
Yeah.
Michael, tell us about your experience with your brother watching.
Sure, absolutely. So Joe and I both grew up in the Midwest. He was in Illinois. I was in Missouri. I was in St. Louis, Missouri. And so I'm a child of the 80s, and I have a little brother who's 2 years younger than me. And so every morning, just like the book talks about, it was our kids' day. You'd wake up super early. You throw those covers off of you. It was in the Midwest. It was very cold. And you, no matter what, you just got your blankets, or you said, the hell of it. You went into the den in our house. But actually, on the way there, we'd stop and get the sugary cereal. For us, it was probably Frosted Flakes or Captain Crunch. And then we would sit in front of the TV set, and we would watch these cartoons. And I can remember as a young kid playing with the toys alongside of watching the show. So if it was He-Man or Transformers, I had the toys right out there, and we were playing along with the shows as we were watching them. And I really think that because I watched Saturday morning cartoons as a kid with my brother, and I think a lot of people feel this way, it sparked my imagination. Joe and I went on to have careers in the creative field, and I think both of us were definitely influenced by our imaginations being developed by these cartoons. And one cartoon in particular that had a big influence on me was Jim Henson's Muppet Babies, because the entire premise of the show is, what if you were allowed these creatures that were surrogates for kids to just allow their imaginations to run free. So you can open a door and suddenly you're in Star Wars, or you're being visited by a dinosaur. And so that free-flowing exchange of ideas, that imagination that it cultivated, led me to do what I do now.
And Joe Garner, what was your experience like as a child watching cartoons?
Oh, it was the same thing. I mean, it was, I loved television. I always loved TV, always have and always will. And very similar to Michael's in the sense that, it was, one of my favorite things to do as a child was to play pretend. And so the cartoons would feed into that, especially, for a kid of the 60s and early 70s, shows like Johnny Quest and the Jetsons. And, I can remember after watching those shows, diving into the junk drawer and pulling out whatever sort of materials I could find that would help me create whatever gadgetry I just saw on the show. So it might be a pie tin or some cardboard and tape and string, and it was just it was just very unique, and it seemed almost magical that there would just be this period of time that was devoted to kids, and it's just unfortunate that kids don't have that experience today, I think, because of the fact that it was by appointment. If you wanted to see Scooby-Doo, you had to be in front of the television at that time on that Saturday, and then later on in the day or the afternoon, you'd play whatever it is you saw, and it was just a wonderful period of time in our history and our culture.
My wife Sharon wants to make a comment.
Before the show, I thought, what can I talk about? I don't know what I'm going to talk about. And as the show started, I'm having so much fun listening to you two. But as the show started, I was sitting here writing myself a half a dozen notes of things that I want to talk about or can talk about. One thing, you mentioned the Jetsons. And I thought how this year, finally, the Jetsons came to life when our son Moss, who's an associate producer at CNN Business, was out in Vegas for a shoot there when they flew a drone. And I thought to myself, the Jetsons, finally, after all these years, I get to see it. It came to life. It's true. It's, And
I was just telling somebody, nothing has been more promised and less delivered than the Jetsons. The artists that were responsible for creating that world, they were sort of given carte blanche as to what they wanted to do, but they needed inspiration. So, keep in mind, the Jetsons debuted in the very early 60s, actually about 7 months after John Glenn made his historic orbit around the Earth. And so we were all, space addled in those days. Everything was about the space race. And what they did was they got this book titled, now remember, this is 1962. So they got this book titled 1975 and the Changes to Come. And, that's where they saw things like flying cars and these homes up on these stilts and things like that. Well, I remember 1975, and we got gypped. There were no flying cars. Mm-hmm. The only houses on stilts were on the hillsides in Southern California. So, it's and here's the funny, what I thought was really interesting is to think about the sort of indelible imprint that the Jetsons have left on our culture. In fact, one automobile maker right now is using the Jetsons theme song in their ads. But it only had 24 original episodes.
Wow.
Just lasted one season in its original airing. And the reason that most people point to the fact that it was canceled was because it was in color. And in 1962, only 3% of U.S. households had color television sets.
That was
So
another
the sort
thing
of bright, shiny future appeared really dull and sort of unengaging in black and white. And that's why it fell flat.
Is that one of your, what are some of your other favorites?
Well, some of my favorites definitely was the Smurfs. So if you think about the Smurfs, which I was saying there, the Jetsons was only on for 24 episodes, but the Smurfs actually was on almost the entire decade of the 80s, and they had 256 episodes. And what was so nice about the Smurfs is that it checked off all of kids' boxes. So it was bizarrely imaginative, it was addictive to watch, it had a clever toy tie-in, and it was simple, but it was still a lot of fun. So it was simple in the fact that even the theme song was just one word, la, 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 la. But yet, they were able to do so much with that show. They had episode after episode. They really expanded that world. And in fact, if you think about, as Joe was saying, Jetsons live on, well, so does the Smurfs. Smurfs just recently had a bunch of movies come out, and there's a whole new generation that's gravitating toward it. Another favorite, too, it's the only live-action show in our book is Pee-wee's Playhouse. And that's another instance of a show that lives on. I have a 3-year-old right now, and we have Netflix, and Pee-wee's Playhouse is actually on Netflix. And so I played it for him because I was wondering, does it still resonate? Do people still like it? And he loves it. In fact, this year he was actually thinking about being Pee-wee for Halloween. So even though that show is extremely bizarre, just like most Saturday morning cartoons were, and zany, and Paul Rubens is kind of like a cartoon character himself, it definitely still resonates, and people still gravitate towards a show like that.
Is that why you included that show in your book? Because it's almost like a cartoon character?
Well, yes. We did struggle with this. We went back and forth with a publisher because there were some really great live-action shows. So for my era, I definitely thought Saved by the Bell was one we wanted to include. But we included because it definitely had a lot of pop cultural influence, and there is animation actually in the show. There's the animation about Penny. It's a kind of claymation animation that was in the show. But that one definitely had a lot of impact on a lot of people.
I think of all the different generations when I'm hearing you speak about, like, the Smurfs, for example, and I'm thinking of that's the era of my niece. The next generation, and then you talk about another character, and I think, oh, that's my children's generation, the next generation. But when I go back to my brothers and I, and another thing you brought to my mind is how I have 3 older brothers, and the one who is the second in line is 10 years older than me. And I remember trying to get him to watch cartoons with my brother Stu, who's with us now, and me. Stu is the 3rd in line, and I'm 4th. So when 3 and 4 were watching cartoons, number 1 was probably working, and number 2 was like, oh, I don't, like, he's so family-oriented beyond belief, but when it came to watching cartoons, he'd say, I just can't, like it was beyond, so if I was 5, he was 15, and he was like off cartoons by then. But then I think from the different generations, so I think when we had our niece over one time, and, oh, Aunt Sharon, I want to watch the Smurfs, and I'm thinking like, oh, okay, like, so then I kind of understood how my brother felt.
Was there something unique about, go ahead.
You know what's interesting is that as cartoons, the cartoon era really began in the early to mid '60s in terms of Saturday mornings, and they were sort of making it up as they went along. And what your story just reminded me of is how Fred Silverman, who was in charge of daytime before he transitioned into primetime at the network, began to see how these anthropomorphic superhero animals, Mighty Mouse and Underdog and so forth, that kids would age out of their interest in those cartoons. there was a period of time where all of a sudden they just, they'd hit, early adolescence, and, seeing an animal as a superhero just didn't do it for them anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's when they started creating more human-like superheroes, mm-hmm. Like Space Ghost and Super Friends and all of that, so that they could keep them harnessed in on Saturday mornings, because, the fact of the matter is, so many of these cartoons were created solely for the purpose of selling cereals and toys. Uh-huh. So they didn't want to lose their grip. And so, as your brother was transitioning out of some shows, they were furiously creating others that they hoped to keep him and guys like his age still engaged.
Are the cartoons written on like two different levels, possibly one to gear to the parents to keep them somewhat interested, and the children, or is it just for the children?
I think that as time went on, it definitely went more towards including the adults in there. We mentioned in the book that it occurred probably in the late 80s, definitely in the 90s, when Steven Spielberg kind of took over that vacuum that Hanna-Barbera had left behind. His cartoons were very knowing, very meta. They break the fourth wall a lot, and so they were also very self-conscious. And so you'd have a show like Animaniacs or Tiny Toon Adventures, and they would be talking to the kids at home, and they'd be self-referential as well. And I think as the 90s went on and we became more of a savvy culture, and we began to be more used to all forms of media, then it's kind of like right now when we have a remix culture where we're so used to different tropes and different things in our culture that we can riff on them and we can compare them to other past references. And so I think it began in the 90s where it really did begin talking to adults. And I think we see that now with the cartoons that come out these days. So even though Saturday morning cartoons are gone, Pixar has kind of picked up the slack for that. And if you've watched any Pixar movies at all, you've seen that there is at one level they've got the kids jokes, the fart jokes, the burping or whatever, the physical comedy. But then there's also a different component, a different level for adults. There's references, whether it be if you're watching Boss Baby or if you're watching any Moana, any of the recent Pixar movies. They've definitely picked up from where the 90s left off, where it was definitely meant for two audiences, the kids and the adults.
Now, you mentioned
Can I just add to that, too? Only because, speaking to the earlier part of the spectrum, Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera, Hanna-Barbera, which, was the production company that really dominated in the 60s, 70s, and most of the 80s, I guess, they had noticed that it was discovered that adults accounted for about 40% of the audience of one of their earliest cartoons, which was the Huckleberry Hound Show. And that's what inspired them to create shows like the Flintstones and the Jetsons and Johnny Quest. Each of those shows started out as a primetime show. And when you look at the sort of the story components of the Flintstones, what they were mirroring was Jackie Gleason's The Honeymooners, both in the disposition of the lead characters and the dynamic of the husbands and the wives of the characters and so forth. So when you look at the scripting of it, when you look at the stories, they very much were trying to go after an adult viewer, as well as hoping that the animation itself would be interesting to the children. And lastly, you look at Bugs Bunny, for instance, which is probably the hallmark of all Saturday morning cartoons, and because it got its start in the 30s. Not as a Saturday morning cartoon, obviously, but as a character. The reason that characters like Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and, most of the Looney Tunes character stable resonates to this day is because of the writing. They didn't just want to have, sort of compelling visual characters. They wanted them to have a real life and a backstory, and so it was the fact that they turned them into real characters that, and again, ones that appealed to adults as well, strongly, that has allowed them to sort of resonate to this very day.
When you brought up Bugs Bunny, I can't help but talk about one of my favorite childhood memories. Our father was a letter carrier, and the Postal Workers Union would have a holiday party. This is the perfect time to talk about it. They would have a holiday party and give out gifts to the children and everything, the workers' children. But they would always, remember, Stu, they would show on the big screen, they would bring out and they would show, and you'd see Bugs Bunny or any of the Looney Tune characters, and I could still picture that big screen with Bugs Bunny's arms stretching out, and also it was probably in color.
In color,
yeah, it was in color, and we had black and white at home with the rabbit ears that we used to have to fix and get rid of the static and everything. So it was so exciting for us to actually see it uninterrupted, as opposed to at home with all that static and whatnot that we had to deal with on the old black and white TV. So
Right.
I remember watching cartoons in the 50s also, but they weren't on Saturday mornings like they were in the 60s?
No, for the most part, they were syndicated. Saturday mornings on, especially, network affiliated or owned and operated stations, that was the domain of public service and news programming. So it was probably, every city had their sort of cartoon show, typically in the late afternoons as a lead into the local news, which led to the network news before primetime schedule. But they all had their sort of cartoon package that they could throw on there. It was cheap programming at a time when, most adults weren't in front of a television set.
Now, your book goes from the 60s through the 90s. Did each decade have its own personality, or how did everything blend together?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say that as we were talking about, the 60s definitely were the classic era where you have shows such as Flintstones, The Jetsons, Bugs Bunny, Johnny Quest, and that set the stage for the 70s. If you think about the 70s, to me, it also very much mirrored what was going on in the culture at the time. When you had a show such as Scooby-Doo, or if you had Josie and the Pussycats, they were definitely reflecting the music that was going on in the era. So, creating a show around mysteries, creating a show about basically teenagers coming to the forefront. Both of those shows having their own rock band. The 70s definitely was that era, and also the 70s introduced a lot of educational components, whether it be Schoolhouse Rock or even Fat Albert. Fat Albert is interesting as a show because, even the name Fat Albert, it's really hard to imagine a show today starring a character named Fat Albert. And even though it wasn't teaching things, like multiplication tables like Schoolhouse Rock was teaching people, it was teaching kids about emotional intelligence, how to deal with social situations. And then I would say the 80s, definitely, Joe, feel free to weigh in on this. I would say that was the era where it was so much about toys. A lot of the cartoons in the 80s were really revolving around the toys, whether that be G.I. Joe action figures, He-Man action figures, Transformers as well.
Transformers, yeah.
And then the 90s, as I was mentioning before, I feel like the 90s definitely was the Steven Spielberg era because he had 3 different shows on, Animaniacs, Tiny Toon Adventures. So I think that and definitely the 90s was when the cartoons really became self-referential.
If I may add, one of the things that I think really makes this book, It's Saturday Morning, such a real nostalgic, immersive experience is that as we've been talking, commercials were very much a part of the experience.
Oh, yes, indeed.
A lot of the cartoons were created solely for the purpose of selling cereal. General Mills and Kellogg's, they were very instrumental in working with with the ad agencies to create various cartoons. Underdog, for instance, was created because General Mills was looking for another cartoon to sell one of their cereals. And so, these were spotlights for toys. So throughout each of the eras, we have a section called After These Messages, where we feature some of the commercials like Slinky and Light Bright, or Encyclopedia Britannica, or
Yes.
Golden Crisp, or Life Cereal. We can all, recall, you sunk my battleship, or, give it to Mikey. Mikey will eat anything, Life Cereal. So because of it being such a part of the experience, throughout the book, we stopped down for a word from these sponsors.
And we have to get a word from our sponsors right now, so we're going to take a quick break. We're speaking this afternoon with Joe Garner and Michael Ashley, who are the authors of It's Saturday Morning, celebrating the golden era of cartoons, 60s through 90s. And we're going to go out, hopefully right now, with the theme song from the Jetsons.
Meet George Jetson. His boy Elroy. Daughter Judy. Jane, his wife.
And this is The World of Work, and I'm your host, Shep Cohen. And this afternoon we're speaking with Michael Ashley and Joe Garner, who are the co-authors of a really fabulous book, one that you can keep on your living room on a table for everyone to look at when they come and visit. It's called It's Saturday Morning, celebrating the golden era of cartoons, 1960s to 1990s. Either Joe or Michael, how did you decide which cartoons to keep in your book, to put in your book?
Well, I think that was definitely a difficult choice to make because there's so many good cartoons out there. But when we were making this decision, when we were contemplating it, we tried to think about what shows were the most iconic, which shows come to mind when you think of Saturday morning cartoons. What are the cartoons that first pop up in your head, the ones that had the most lasting impact on fans and viewers? And so Joe and I had a list that we both researched based on decades, and then we also talked to our publisher too, and we tried to filter down and see, okay, this one would make the cut, even if it was only a show on for one season like the Jetsons. I mean, you can't imagine having a Saturday morning cartoon book without the Jetsons. So we tried to think about shows that even if they were only on for a season or two, like Space Ghost, if it still had a cultural resonance, that people still talk about it, if it has a big fan base, then we definitely put it in the book. And like Joe mentioned, we wanted to give people that immersive feel, and so we also thought of what commercials really speak to the times, whether it be Teddy Ruxpin or like Joe said, if it's Battleship. Which shows can you associate, can you think about going hand in hand with the cartoons that you watched growing up as a kid?
Yeah, and we had, we've already received a little criticism for cartoons that we didn't include, but as I shared earlier, I've been doing these collections for nearly 20 years now. And I learned very early on that you can't include everything because if we did, we'd still be working on the book and you'd have to take out a mortgage to buy it. So we don't mind being criticized for what we don't include. But if people can take issue with what does get included, then that gives us a little bit of a concern. But I think we're on pretty safe ground with with what we've included in It's Saturday Morning.
Is there anything that you thinking back, that you think you should have included that you didn't, or you're satisfied?
Well, I can tell you, Michael alluded to it a moment ago, where he was saying that we had a debate with the publisher, and we had a little bit of an arm wrestle. I mean, I grew up in the 60s, but really aware by the early 70s, and there used to be a production team called Sid and Marty Croft Productions, and they did live action shows like H.R. Puffin stuff and Boogaloos and Banana Splits, and they were goofy. They were sort of they were puppets and costumes that people would wear and that sort of thing. And I as a child, I really enjoyed those, but I was overruled, with the one exception, rightfully, being Pee-wee's Playhouse. But that was a genre that I had hoped that we could have included, but certainly understood why, when we really looked at what was the important criteria, that those were sacrificed.
Being a writer, you make an excellent point about having to cut it off and get on with your book. But one of the collections that we have, my brothers and I, or mainly my brother Stu and I, would send for pictures of the characters, and so excited waiting for the mail to come, and we have pictures of the Jetson characters and all of them. So, yeah. Do you still have yours?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
so
do we.
I used to, I grew up in the cornfields of Illinois, and so my touch with Hollywood was to send away for autographs and pictures and that kind of thing. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
Well, we grew up in Union County, New Jersey, but we still did that.
Yeah,
and loved when they came in. When they came in the mail.
But television was so much different in that era. It was, nowadays, I guess because we can watch anything we want at any time we want, it sort of loses its sort of specialness. But
kids around the whole
I can totally relate.
Kids around the whole country were all united watching the same shows.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what Howie Mandel talked about in his Ford, and it couldn't be more true. I mean, this was the last real cultural artifact that we all shared, no matter if you were a boy or a girl, if you were rich or poor. Everybody was tuning into the same material every Saturday. We all had the same cultural language. We talked about the same cartoons. It's interesting. We both, Joe and I, have had this experience. Whenever we are in a group of people and we pull out this book, everybody gathers around and they talk about remembering what it was like, because everyone experienced it. Everyone went through that stage and watched these shows as kids, and they can put themselves back there to their childhoods. And that was a really special thing. Of course, the internet is an amazing thing. People are probably live streaming this on the web right now. And of course, we use the internet big time to research this book. But the internet also tends to atomize audiences. It separates people. And so everyone has kind of got their own personal viewing routine now. You have your own personal shows, your own favorites, but we're not all coming together as a culture like we did when there was only 3 channels. And so that's why I think it was the last real time that people all connected in that same way with the same programs.
Good point. We were all humming the same tunes on the way to school, walking to school in those days, right?
Yeah. I mean, you get it a little bit now. Like I mentioned, I have a 3-year-old, and so he likes things like Paw Patrol and Octonauts. And if you go to a park in our town here, a lot of the kids will be wearing the same outfits and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But I will say, though, maybe it sounds like a purist, but that's okay because we wrote this book for purists as well. I don't think that Paw Patrol and Octonauts just have the same heft and the same power that some of these other cartoons did. It feels like there was a kind of soul to them, even though people may have decried the fact in the 80s that a lot of these shows were based around toys like He-Man. There still was so much time and energy spent on world building and storytelling. You could tell that the writers really were stretching their imaginations, and they were going back to old stories that may have come out of classic Greek plays. They were really stretching their imaginations, and there was a real heart to those cartoons.
Now, you talked about animators and how have things changed with computer-generated figures as opposed to the animator. Tell us, the animator was a real high-status person in the cartoon industry, I guess, in the 60s, 70s.
But yeah, and it's interesting. You go back to something like Bugs Bunny, which to me is a perfect example of how important the animator was, because most famously, you had Chuck Jones, Fritz Freeling, and Robert McKinson, and forgive me, I know there's one other that I neglected to mention, but each one of them had an effect on the development of Bugs Bunny. And they'll say, I was the one that sort of rounded out his eyes. I was the one that, that straightened his ears and this kind of stuff. And you can see, nearly every animation director at Warner Brothers between 1945 and 1964 worked on Bugs. But those guys were the most famous that had the biggest impact. Not to take anything away from computer animation. My gosh, Pixar has created what I think ultimately will become classics. But there's just something about there's just something a little richer in quality and so forth in some of the earlier techniques of animation versus sort of the anime and CGI computer generated animation that they do today.
I might actually even liken it to, if you go back and you listen to old phonograph records, you get a different experience when you're listening to it. People often say, we just got a record player because my wife and I were remembering how much fun it was to listen to records. But I think there's definitely that richer feel when you listen to a record as opposed to listening to, Spotify on your phone. And if you look at a show like Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, they were using old-fashioned animation and hand-drawn artwork with rotoscope. And they were having people, Lou Scheimer's team would actually shoot live action footage of a model doing the movements that Tarzan would perform in the show, like running, jumping, swinging from vines, and then they would hand paint over it. And so it was kind of like a labor of love in a lot of ways, the amount of time they would take to create a show like this, whereas nowadays you can definitely make a cartoon much more easily, but in a way it kind of lends itself to having a throwaway culture where people don't appreciate the artwork and the artistry that comes with being an artisan, the taking the time to really create something that was meaningful for you that took hours and hours and hours to accomplish.
How about catchphrases? When did they start?
Oh gosh, yeah, I think with Bugs Bunny, his "What's up, Doc," for instance, which probably is his most famous. That came from director Tex Avery, who's credited with providing Bugs Bunny with that trademark. He wrote it into the script in one of Bugs' very first appearances. It was a short called A Wild Hare. And Avery grew up in Texas. That's how he got his nickname. And he didn't think much of the phrase when he included it, but he didn't realize how much, it would catch on. And it add into that, not necessarily a catchphrase, but the way he would deliver it is usually munching on carrots. Mm-hmm. And they got that from a Clark Gable movie. It Happened One Night. It's a 1934 film. Freeling liked this scene where Gable was sort of chomping on carrots while he was talking with Claudette Colbert. And so Mel Blanc, who provided the voice for Bugs Bunny, mimicked it by eating carrots while he was performing and munching and spitting and reciting the lines and, chomp, 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 what's up, Doc? And gosh, and it goes on into, Scooby-Doo. Michael, some of the, 70s and 80s cartoons, there were always catchphrases.
Stuart has a comment.
Yes, well, one of the things that, thinking about the Jetsons theme, for example, shows how television has changed over the years. All the shows used to have theme songs like Mary Tyler Moore Golden Girls, Greatest American Hero, and now you hardly ever get a theme song on a television show.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what I was saying before earlier. We were talking about the fact that people have gotten so media savvy that they just don't even want to wait around for something to happen. Like I was watching the movie Deer Hunter the other day, and that's a 3-hour movie, and they take the first hour just to really bring you into the world of these guys before they go to Vietnam. And I was thinking how different that is from a movie that you would watch today. If you watch an action movie like The Bourne Identity, you have quick action shots where people aren't willing to be patient anymore. And I would, Joe, feel free, of course, to weigh in here too, but I would say that a lot of it has to do with the way that our brains have been rewired because of the new media that we watch all the time. We grew up in an era when you can, in your pocket, you can pull up YouTube and you can watch any video, all kinds of videos. And so people now have a shorthand, and so they're not willing to have the same patience to watch a movie like Casablanca where things unfold slowly. And the same thing with theme songs. They just want to get right to it. Let's get right into the action because they want to get people into watching the material.
Yeah, you're right. It's I have a friend who created what's called opening title sequences, which is typically, it's sort of a montage of either scenes from whatever the show is, and they did this on cartoons as well, and that's where you would have the opening theme song. Well, then there came a sort of a new style, a new approach, where you wouldn't even have an opening title sequence anymore. You would just jump right into the show. And a lot of procedural dramas do that today. I think of the Blacklist, for instance. I mean, it starts right in with the show, and the title sequence is less than 10 seconds, I think. And I think that's sort of, that's sort of the way things have become produced. But, there was an era of Saturday morning cartoons where music was everything. I think about, shows like the Archies, where they had a whole segment where the real band that performed all of the music for the cartoon characters would feature a new song or a new dance of the week. So, and I think it holds as being the only cartoon to launch a song that went on to become the #1 song in the nation, and that was Sugar Sugar back in 1969. It was a #1 hit single.
I know that very well. That was
we've kind of gone full circle from music being important and featured to, little to none.
Actually, when my wife and I went on our first date in 1969, that was the #1 song, Sugar Sugar, by the Archies.
I still love that song. I'm a pop music fan, which used to drive my kids crazy. But and the more bubblegum, the better. So that's right at the top.
Well, my wife and I had certain responsibilities for our children, and my major one was having them learn about 60s rock and roll.
There you go.
My parents made me sit down, especially with people like Paul Simon. I remember sitting at dinner and they said, "Now look, you're not getting up from the table. I want you to listen to this music and appreciate it." And same thing with the Beatles as well. And they also liked all forms of pop music. So at one point they said, "No, we're going to watch Saturday Night Fever." And I think they forgot that there's actually quite a lot of nudity and swearing in Saturday Night Fever. But they wanted me to get to understand all of the great music. I mean, like the DJs coming out of the 70s, because they said, "Look, you guys just don't understand with your rap music what it was like in the 1960s and 1970s when we came up."
Now, you talk about theme songs. I still remember every word of the Beverly Hillbillies theme song. I guess it's the Ballad of Jed Clampett. And my son was taking a course in New York on TV history, and he put me through FaceTime on a screen in his the auditorium of the course that he was taking, and I sang it to his class. And I knew it without notes.
The musicians, we were talking about collecting autographs earlier. The musicians that were responsible for that were Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. Very first autograph I ever got was from Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. So it's amazing the influence that the Beverly Hillbillies theme song can have.
Yes. And you mentioned a little bit about some of the voices, like Mel Blanc. Tell us about the great voices that were involved in cartoons.
Well, we had part of the reason why it was so exciting to have Howie Mandel do this book and do the forward for this book was because he was seminal in this world too. He was doing several of the characters in the show The Muppet Babies, but he also did the characters. He also created and did the characters for Bobby's World that came out in the 90s. And people may not realize, but that show almost went the entire length of the 90s. That's how many episodes there were of Howie Mandel's voice doing that show. But also people like Don Messick, who was doing nearly no matter what the show was in the 1980s, he was somehow involved in it. That was a person just like Mel Blanc that a master at all kinds of different voices.
Daws Butler is another one. Penny Singleton, she played Jane Jetson. She also did the voice of Blondie. June Foray, who passed away just relatively recently, provided the voice to Rocky the Squirrel and so many others. I mean, that was the thing. You mentioned, somebody like Mel Blanc. When one of the most powerful obituaries I think I ever saw was when he passed away. They just Warner Brothers took out a full page ad in all of the major industry trade publications, and it was all of the Looney Tunes cartoons, Foghorn Claghorn and Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny. I mean, just imagine all of them, and with their heads bowed. And the caption was, "We're speechless." It was that kind of an impact. He was the voice of every single one of those cartoons. And he was also Barney Rubble. And he was so instrumental to that. He had gotten into an automobile accident, and they needed to finish recording the voice tracking for the season. And he was such a trooper, the show must go on type of personality, that they moved the recording into his hospital room. And he recorded the voices laid flat out in the hospital bed, and the rest of them were all around him, recording their scripts right along with him. But just had such a major impact. Nobody else, I think, comes close. Don Messick, maybe.
Frank Welker.
Frank Welker, exactly.
Yeah.
No one knew these people, though. You knew the voice, but you didn't know who it was.
Yeah, they're sort of the faceless superstars, but boy, were they in demand. And when Howie talked about with such reverence being in the Hanna-Barbera studio with somebody like a Don Messick, and I don't know if he worked with Daws Butler or not. I don't recall. You, Michael?
No, but I might liken to character actors. I mean, they're people that we've seen again and again in movies, but they kind of blend into the scenery. They've never made it big like a Tom Cruise kind of leading man, but they're just hardworking people that get their paycheck and they contribute and they find fulfillment. I would say it might be kind of similar for these guys too, unless you're someone like Mel Blanc that really hit it big time, where people definitely know him because he was such a big deal on so many cartoons. I think a lot of them, they definitely love their craft, and I think from researching this book, you could definitely tell that there was this really strong community amongst these voice actors. They would go to conventions year after year. They actually would get a lot of fan mail. People that were seriously in love with these cartoons, they would know who the voice actors are. But I think they had their own community, and they were bolstered by that, by having friends, and they would do, they'd be working on the next project, and they would go from project to project, seeing the same people, seeing their friends again and again.
You're talking about projects. The project you two worked on in this book, I understand you wanted to get the book out and get it published, but you must have felt a little sad when you ended and the book was ready. You were no longer researching.
That's just sort of part of the deal. You just there was a producer one time who told me he does most of the opening and closing ceremony. His name's Don Misher. And he said, eventually you just have to abandon the project. You could work on these kinds of things forever, but, fortunately and unfortunately, there are things like deadlines. And so, yeah, it's a little bit gypsy-like. You're completely immersed in something, and but you got to get it done, and you got to get it done on time, and that's just just a sad fact of the profession.
This has been such a fun and educational broadcast. Can't wait to share this with our future son-in-law. He's in program development at one of the Hollywood studios, TV studios, and I think he'll gain a lot. This is going to be a great gift for him to learn more of the things about how it's done and all. And I just want to make one more little announcement, and then I'll leave the rest to you. I just want to say that even though, or maybe because he grew up with cartoons, that Shep is in the Best Lawyers insert today in the New York Times on page 24. One of the best lawyers again. So.
Wow. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Aside from radio show host.
Thank you. Gentlemen, how can someone get a copy of your book?
Well, you can find It's Saturday Morning every place. Any place that you can buy books, brick and mortar stores around the country, but certainly Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. You can find It's Saturday Morning every place.
We have a minute left. Just any closing thoughts for my listeners?
Sure, I can go first. What I'd say is that what we tried to evoke with this book is a magical time that will never come back, and in a way that is sad, but that's kind of what life is. You have as Joe was mentioning earlier, you work on a project and then you have to move on, and in a lot of ways we've moved on as a culture from this. But it was our hope with this book to return people back to their childhoods. There's a lot going on in the world right now. There's a lot of reasons to be scared or frustrated or nervous, but we try to give people an experience that was evocative, that reminded them about how much fun they had in their childhoods and about the magic and wonder that you felt growing up. And it's our greatest hope that people feel that way by reading this book.
I guess we have to go, Joe, with 10 seconds.
No, I would just say I completely agree with everything that Michael has said. We're hoping to give people a wonderful opportunity for some nostalgia and some, just to relive a wonderful time. And thank you for giving us the time to share this with everybody.
My pleasure. It was really very interesting and a lot of fun. Joe Garner and Michael Ashley, authors of It's Saturday Morning, celebrating the golden era of cartoons, 60s to the 90s. Until next week, this is The World of Work. I'm your host, Shep Cohen.